This is Special Prosecutor Larry Klayman.
I'm the only lawyer ever to obtain a court ruling that a president of the United States committed a crime.
For truth. For competition.
As a young lawyer, I helped break up AT&T. That's why you have all your cell phones today.
For sovereignty. For the Republic.
I'm the guy who at Judicial Watch, which I founded, uncovered the Chinagate scandal. Millions of dollars going to the Clinton campaign, corrupting our political system.
For the privacy of citizens.
And I'm the only guy to have enjoined the National Security Agency from mass surveillance on hundreds of millions of Americans.
Tearing it up.
I'm the son of meatpackers in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I know how to slice and dice.
Bringing it back.
We're going to take this country apart and put it back together again in the way envisioned by our founding fathers.
It's not just talk.
We're not just regurgitating news stories. Larry Klayman, special prosecutor, is making the news.
And now, here's Larry.
Welcome to this week's edition of Special Prosecutor with Larry Klayman. A lot going on. Just last Friday, I conducted the oral argument with regard to Cliven Bundy's appeal, not his appeal, but the appeal by the Trump Justice Department, if you can believe that. After we secured the dismissal of his indictment over the so-called standoff at Bunkerville, where Bundy was not violent, but the government was, where his family was assaulted, where his dog was kicked, where his cattle were killed and buried in a secret mass grave. I mean, one atrocity after another. We finally succeeded in getting his indictment dismissed. And lo and behold, who allowed for taking an appeal? Attorney General Bill Barr, if you can believe that, and his prior predecessor, that worthless Attorney General Jeff Sessions. It's unbelievable. And while the president can talk about possibly pardoning Roger Stone, who doesn't deserve it, he's convicted on 7 counts, 5 of perjury, 1 of obstruction of justice, 1 witness tampering. And frankly, he presented no witnesses at trial. Listen to that, because the BS that you hear on Tucker Carlson or on Fox or from Rush or anybody else, that's what it is. It's BS. I love Rush, but frankly, he does not know what's going on frequently. He sits in a radio studio, and I'll get into that later. But in fact, it's the Bundys who deserve. They don't need a pardon. They just need to have Barr order the withdrawal of this appeal. So I argued that last Friday. And one of the things that I pointed out was, notwithstanding the fact that there was all this prosecutorial abuse that resulted in Judge Navarro, who, by the way, was recommended by that evil Senator Harry Reid and appointed by Barack Obama, hardly a friend of the Bundys and the peaceful protesters that came to Bunkerville to support them that were also indicted. Even she had to dismiss it in the end. And that was after the hometown newspaper, the Las Vegas Review-Journal, excoriated her. And that's not a conservative publication, by the way, as having a friend, being the friend of the prosecutors and committing all these constitutional rights violations up to that point. Cliven and his sons and the others had been arrested. They were denied bail, despite the fact that there were threat assessments by our so-called government that they were peaceful and not dangerous. Cliven and his son Ammon were thrown in solitary confinement. Their speedy trial rights were violated. They sat in prison for 2 years, having done no crime. 2 years, I might add. And then last but not least, hardly least, Navarro wouldn't let me into the case as trial counsel. I participated in other ways from the outside, and I also filed a lawsuit in Washington, D.C., and I currently have malicious prosecution lawsuits in the courts and other lawsuits to get justice after what happened. You know, I was kept out of this case. And I then discovered through the Freedom of Information Act case I brought in D.C. in a very difficult way, because the judge was rubber stamping everything that the FBI and Bureau of Land Management wanted. In fact, they told her it would take 40 years to produce documents. She'd be dead. I'd be dead. Even the young lawyer representing BLM and the Justice Department, that is their FBI, would be near death. We obtained documents showing that a whistleblower who had already come forward had all kinds of evidence that there was a kill list on the heads of the Bundys, that they were disparaging their Mormon faith as, in effect, subhuman, that exculpatory Brady material that would go to acquit the Bundys and the others was withheld, that the prosecutors participated in withholding it. I can go on and on and on. So what I told the court last Friday was, affirmed the dismissal, Your Honor. But even if the matter went back to Navarro again, it would be dismissed again because we didn't even have the benefit of that evidence at the time she made her dismissal back in January of 2018. This thing's already dragged on another 2.5 years because the government kept delaying appeals. They couldn't figure out what to do. And what is this appeal about? It's about covering the derriere of the prosecutors who should lose their legal license and never be able to practice law again, much more be indicted for crimes, lying, cheating, and doing everything they could to get innocent people convicted. This, fellow patriots and friends, is your government. And this is why you have Freedom Watch as your private Justice Department, because our worthless and overstuffed Attorney General, Bill Barr, I wrote to him. I said, dismiss this appeal. No response. I tried to communicate with him in other ways. No response. And, just in the last few weeks, and this is where I get into Rush again, he says, I'm not going to ever investigate or prosecute Obama or the Biden over the unmasking of General Flynn, which was illegal, a violation of privacy, a violation of our surveillance laws. They're above the law. That's in effect what he said. Oh, we can't touch a president. You know why he doesn't want to touch a president? Because the president has dirt on him. Because if he pushes too hard, he'll go down and he'll be smeared and his family will be dragged through the mud like the president has had happen to him. He's no friend of the president. He's no more loyal to the president than Jeff Sessions was loyal to the president. And the president recently made a statement to the people of Alabama because Sessions is running for Senate there again, if you can believe that, because he has nothing to do. He never had a real job in his entire life. The president said, don't vote for the guy. The guy is disloyal. So this is where we are. And it's interesting. And I wrote a column last Friday. You can find it at freedomwatchusa.org. We have a situation in Minnesota where apparently a police officer, who knows, I'm withholding any kind of verdict in my own mind, but it would appear from video footage that a Black American was murdered. And we have riots. Doesn't justify the looting, the burning, the stealing, everything else. But you can understand why people feel so strongly when the government overreaches. Well, nobody ever felt that strongly about the Bundys, and there's a dichotomy in this country, okay? If you're white, you don't feel too strongly about what happened. Things have flipped over the years. Now, I'm a civil rights lawyer. African Americans, white Americans, yellow Americans, green Americans, blue Americans, red Americans, we all deserve the same rights. But you see, Bob Cliven, it's left in the wake. And nothing happens in terms of getting him justice, at least in terms of this Justice Department. Now, it was interesting in the opening argument, one of the judges, Judge Fletcher, says, well, I'm not blaming the lawyers for this. It must have been FBI or the Bureau of Land Management that withheld evidence and acted in an inappropriate way. And I had to abuse him of that notion because I commenced an Inspector General and Office of Professional Responsibility investigation of these prosecutors, which in theory should be going on. But I believe that was buried too, probably buried by Bill Barr. Now let's get to Rush Limbaugh, who I love, and I hope that he recovers from his cancer. I pray that he will be well. But I walk in today when my colleague this week is listening to one of his broadcasts, and he's quoting my former colleague, Fitton, of all people, who's not even a lawyer, saying, we need a special counsel to investigate what went on with regard to the unmasking of General Flynn and the involvement of Obama and the involvement of Joe Biden, who were involved. We now know that from the release of documents that came out by the government. And then he says, well, I really can't explain why Barr, doesn't want to go against them, but I think we should have a special counsel. Now, Fitton recommends Sidney Powell, and she did a good job, but I think we should have Andrew McCarthy. Two fallacies in that. And that tells you why Rush, as smart as he is, having sat in a radio studio for his entire professional life, does not really understand what goes on in Washington. He still doesn't understand. And of course, Hannity doesn't want to understand because he's boosting ratings. So he promises things that are never going to happen. The protege, or Mark Levin, same thing. This is the fact that, number one, there's not going to be another special counsel, not after what happened in the Russian witch hunts or the Ukrainian witch hunts. There's obviously no courage at the Justice Department to do that. And It belies the notion that Andy McCarthy, will do anything tough. Andrew McCarthy writes for the National Review. The National Review was against the election of Trump. It still is. It considers itself a pure conservative. It's not really a pure conservative. There are a bunch of hacks over there, establishment hacks that marinate in the filth of Washington, D.C. They want to be part of the club. So at that time, Trump was not part of the club. He's still not part of the club. And I love the president. But the reality is this president is not even really a Republican. He's not. So to say that Andrew McCarthy is going to get to the bottom of it, forget it. It's the American people that must get to the bottom of it. Once this coronavirus subsides, we will put this issue in front of our citizens' grand juries. We will indict Obama. We will indict Biden. I already have lawsuits against Biden for what he did with me and the social media companies. And you cannot depend on this corrupted Justice Department run by this overstuffed blowhard by the name of Barr, who's part of the Republican establishment, to do anything. He hasn't indicted the Clintons. He hasn't indicted Comey. Hasn't indicted Clapper, Brennan, McCabe, or the Lovebirds, anybody. Okay? Because in Washington, D.C., it's all for show. It's not for dough. We know that. Go back and think about what's been happening in the last decades since I started Judicial Watch and now Freedom Watch. It's been me who's had to take these actions. And why isn't it that Larry Klayman is not mentioned as special counsel? I'll get this thing over in 48 hours. You can count on that. But they don't want to do that because they don't want anybody that would actually do the job, because then the blowback would go back to them. And that's what happens. And the fact that Rush doesn't mention it, doesn't mention me, he's been, brainwashed by Levin or other people that, they're the greatest thing since sliced bread. Levin was always very envious of me when I was at Judicial Watch. Levin, by the way, feeds Rush information. So this is what happens. I'll be right back with Francis Boyle, a professor of the University of Illinois School of Law, is an expert in bioweapons and has had a personal experience with it. Listen to this carefully because the Chinese need to account and they will account, and we have the experts to make them account. I'll be right back.
Dangerous.
You don't hear, use the court and the law.
Lethal.
This is bad.
Special prosecutor.
Very bad.
Larry Klayman.
If you'd like to support Freedom Watch and this radio show, go to freedomwatchusa.org.
As you all know, Freedom Watch has brought a class action lawsuit in Dallas, Texas, for the immense damage that Communist China has done to our country, not just in terms of health, but in terms of our economic welfare. People have lost their jobs. They've lost their businesses. Trillions of dollars out of your pocket, taxpayers' monies have been used to bail out the damage, to pay for the damage. And frankly, we should not have to pay for it. Our kids and grandchildren should not be forced to live in abject poverty. And that's why we brought this lawsuit. We also have another case, a parallel case in Jerusalem, Israel, by very fine Israeli lawyers, my colleagues, very similar. It's proceeding on two tracks. And we have a criminal complaint at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, Holland, to hold these communist Chinese leaders accountable and to throw them in prison where the sun don't shine. I'm very proud to bring on this show someone who is an expert in bioweapons, a professor of the very prestigious School of Law at Illinois in College of Law. And I want him to explain, his name is Francis Boyle, and you're going to hear much more about him, because he has tremendous expertise in the field of bioweapons. He knows what went on here, and what he's going to tell you is going to be extremely enlightening and very important. Francis, tell people your background. You can do it much better than I can because you have a very distinguished background. And tell us why you've come to the conclusion that what China developed was a bioweapon and how it got released from that laboratory in Wuhan, and how we have actually, our country may have actually aided that in terms of it happening.
Well, Larry, thank you for having me on, and my best to your listening audience. Yeah, I'm a professor of law here at the University of Illinois College of Law, but for our purposes here, I drafted the U.S. domestic implementing legislation for the Biological Weapons Convention that the U.S. government became a party to in 1974 under President Nixon. And my legislation was entitled the Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989 that was approved unanimously by both houses of the United States Congress and signed into law by President George H.W. Bush Sr. And that story is told in my book, Biowarfare and Terrorism, that people can find at Amazon.com if they want to. So I've been involved in this issue professionally since about 1983, when the Council for Responsible Genetics established in Cambridge, Mass, that had at that time some of the top life scientists at Harvard and MIT set it up, and they asked me to get involved and handle their biological warfare work for them. And at that time, one of the problems that had emerged is that the Reagan administration and its neocons decided to get into using DNA genetic engineering to manufacture biological weapons. So it was my advice that we move forward to finally have time, as we were supposed to have domestic implementing legislation for the Biological Weapons Convention. That had been required all along, but we never got around to it. But also specifically to deal with the use of DNA genetic engineering for that purpose, to make it quite clear it was covered, because when the BWC was negotiated, DNA genetic engineering was in its infancy. Of course, it was covered and contemplated, but I wanted to make it clear that it was. And then also, I guess in anticipation in the future, I had it, the legislation is still on the books, United States Code, deal with synthetic biology. So that too is listed in my statute. Since then, it's been revised twice to deal with what I did not contemplate. I never really contemplated that legitimate life science institutions like the Centers for Disease Control or American Type Culture Collection would get involved in...
Dr. Boyle, we'll be right back with our next segment where we have a lot more time to get through this. We'll be right back.
And now, 4 words that make corrupt politicians make wee-wee in their little pants.
Transparency and the rule of law will be the touchstones of this presidency.
But we have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
Special Prosecutor Larry Klayman.
Be the one who makes our country great again. Go to freedomwatchusa.org and donate.
I'm back with Dr. Francis Boyle, bioweapons expert, professor of the University of Illinois College of Law. We were talking about his background in bioweapons and leading up to what has happened with regard to the Communist Chinese Wuhan laboratory that released this as a bioweapon. Go ahead, Doctor. Fill us in.
Well, in any event, Larry, to make a long story short, ever since 1983, I've kept track of and tried to oppose the use of biological weapons, research, development, et cetera. And so I've paid attention to what you would say are mysterious, unexplained outbreaks of epidemics around the world, and try to determine, well, what was this naturally caused, or could there be a biological warfare agent at work? And to make a long story short, I was on sabbatical all last fall writing a book So I didn't really pay attention to what was going on in China until I got back here in my office for the start of the spring semester just before the King holiday, and began paying attention to this. On January 17th, I saw a news story out of China saying large numbers of cases of an unexplained pneumonia have just been reported from Wuhan, China. So I run a little private biological warfare list with some friends, and I said, well, the real question here is there a BSL-4 in Wuhan, China? And I didn't have time to answer that question. Classes resumed. I was teaching. I was busy for a week. And so the morning of January 24, I did do some research, and sure enough, there was a BSL-4 right there in Wuhan, China. And I already knew that SARS, which gives pneumonia symptoms, was a weaponized coronavirus that had leaked out of Chinese biological warfare laboratories before. And, SARS was extremely dangerous and also infectious and lethal and infectious, and there had been a pandemic of SARS around the world, which fortunately was contained. But given the updates and everything, later that morning, I put out a worldwide press release because I used to work with a PR agent here, and before he retired, he gave me all his sources, saying, well, it's pretty clear that what happened here in Wuhan came out of that Wuhan BSL-4, and it probably was SARS with gain-of-function properties, and that makes it existentially dangerous. So I circulated that over to news media sources, and then later that day on the 24th, I gave an interview to a news source called Geopolitics and Empire, and they put it on the web the following Wednesday, and it went viral. So ever since then, I've been very busy giving interviews on this, and since that time, Larry, there has now come out documented proof of what I was saying. There is a scientific article that you can find on the internet. It's been in so many of the interviews I've given. Just Google my name. Out of the University of North Carolina, where they had taken it. There was a BSL-3, Larry, and you need at least a BSL-3 to safely weaponize SARS. And it was clear when you read through this article that the University of North Carolina people out there had taken SARS, which was a very dangerous weaponized coronavirus to begin with, and in addition had given it gain-of-function properties to make it more lethal and more infectious. And working with the team there at the University of North Carolina was a scientist from the Wuhan BSL-4 that provided them with a synthetic coronavirus to begin with. Fort Detrick was also involved in this. The Dana-Farber Cancer Institute was involved in this. The FDA was involved in this. The National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases under Tony Fauci had approved and funded the entire thing. And it was also approved by the National Institutes of Health. And they expressly stated that they knew how dangerous it was. Indeed, it was paused by the Obama administration for further studies, along with these other dual-use projects involving gain-of-function. And then the Obama administration renewed it. While it was paused, Tony Fauci, NIH, NIAID paid for the Wuhan BSL-4 to continue it. And it turns out the Wuhan BSL-4 was also a designated research biological factory by the WHO and also Harvard, my alma mater. So, think about that. It would be like the WHO and the NIH and NIAID and Harvard all working with Fort Detrick because that Wuhan BSL-4 is China's Fort Detrick. So over time, Larry, more evidence has come out to support what I am saying. Indeed, all of a sudden, all these microbiologists came out of the woodwork to attack what I was saying, and I won't go through all their names here, but it turns out each and every one of them was working at their own BSL-3 and up to their eyeballs in what only can be called Nazi biowarfare, death science, dirty work. If you look at, all you had to do was a little due diligence research on these people. And I had called for all these BSL-3 and these BSL-4 labs to be shut down immediately and completely, which I did again earlier this week. And then the researchers there, the scientists, everyone involved there at the University of North Carolina, Dana Farber at Harvard, and Tony Fauci, NIH, and the rest of them, they all run a risk of criminal prosecution under my biological weapons anti-terrorism act that provides for life imprisonment for anyone involved in this type of work. Indeed, Larry, I'm sort of a belt and suspenders lawyer, probably like you. So after I drafted that and it was passed into law, I put out notices in some of the leading scientific publications, including Science, that all microbiologists read, with a headline saying it's quite clear you face life in prison if you do any of this biological warfare work. But,
Francis, let me stop you there. What is,
sorry, Larry.
For our listeners, what does BSL mean? What's that acronym mean? BSL.
Pardon me?
BSL.
It's called the Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989. Right. You can find it on Wikipedia, and it clearly mentions that I'm the author of it. It was
now why
my idea, right?
Okay.
And then
why did
citations to U.S. code?
Why did Tony Fauci? Why did the Obama administration? Why did Fort Detrick send the seeds of this virus over to the bioweapons lab in Wuhan, China? Why did we do that?
Well, Larry, money talks. And it turns out, if you read this article from the University of North Carolina, the Chinese government bought and paid for this Wuhan researcher scientist to get involved with North Carolina because they had the technology at that time to give it gain-of-function properties. And then she brought it back to Wuhan. And it's even worse than that, Larry, because I also discuss, and you can find it on Google, that Wuhan also sent a scientific researcher to the Australian Health Lab, and they DNA genetically engineered SARS with HIV, which gives you AIDS. And they brought that technology back to Wuhan BSL-4 as well. Indeed, now even the Five Eyes, the intelligence agency collective for U.S., Britain, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, has stated this publicly in a memo they leaked to the Australian Daily News that I've discussed elsewhere. they've said, yes, both these contracts were involved in there, University of North Carolina and Australian Health Board, and they were both taken back to Wuhan BSL-4, and the Chinese government bought and paid for putting their researcher there into the Australian Health Board. And it's even worse than that, Larry, now, in that recently it has come to my attention documentation from their website that the Wuhan BSL-4 was and had successfully put viruses like this COVID-19 and reduce them and aerosolize them with nanotechnology. And
which makes them lighter than air. Which makes them lighter than air and spreads quicker, correct?
Right, Dr. And Larry, it floats on the air. And that is why this MIT scientist reported that COVID-19 had traveled 27 feet in her office. So this is pure balderdash by the CDC that it's only spread by droplets. And the last time we confronted publicly, we know Fort Detrick has aerosolized with nanotechnology different types of biological warfare weapons. But the last time one of these was released on publicly and used was, of course, the Amerithrax attacks of October 2001, and that was a super weapons grade anthrax. It had been involved nanotechnology. You had 1 million spores per gram. And that obviously came out of, I had told the FBI as soon as that technology became public in the New York Times, this could only have come out of a U.S. biological warfare program.
Well, and we're running out of time, Doctor. I'm going to bring you back next week if you're free, but this helps explain why the government...
Larry, which is you can only work with nanotechnology at a BSL-4 because you have to wear a moon suit. That's how dangerous it is, and you have to have your own portable air supply. This is what we are dealing with today, Larry. It's existentially dangerous against the American people, and far more dangerous than the CDC is telling us, because they're up to their eyeballs in this stuff, and they are seriously undercounting certainly the number of deaths. Yesterday, we reached the 100,000 mark.
Hold on 1 second, Doctor. I'm going to bring you back for the final segment. We'll be right back.
Before he was a trial lawyer, he sliced him and diced him.
People used to ask me, Larry, what caused you to start Judicial Watch and now Freedom Watch, given the powerful forces in this country that put you at risk?
In a meat packing plant.
I'm the son of meat packers in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I know how to slice and dice.
A very special prosecutor, Larry Klayman.
If you'd like to support Freedom Watch and this radio show, go to freedomwatchusa.org.
We're back in the verdict section, and let's get a verdict here. Is that what appears happened is that Fort Detrick, the lab that actually created the anthrax, which got loose after 9/11, that actually develops bioweapons, as I've been saying, we do the same thing, gave the Chinese the seeds, and then they one-upped it. They made it much more dangerous, that it released either accidentally or by design from Wuhan, China. But obviously, they didn't inform the world of what was going on because this was secret, giving rise to the tremendous damage that's caused today. It's another example, frankly, of how our government doesn't tell us what the true facts are, talks out of both sides of its mouth. And it also tells us something as to why President Trump has gone relatively light on China. He must have been briefed on this in some way, and he knows that we have culpability as well. And it's a tragic, tragic situation, and it's why yours truly personally can't believe a word that the government says anymore. Not nothing, not a zip. Anyway, I want people to join our class actions, and I'm going to turn this over to conclude with Dr. Boyle, because it's important that we, the people, rise up. Our government has failed us. Obviously, the Chinese communists want to destroy us, and we're in a situation where only we can represent our own interests. So go to freedomwatchusa.org, sign up, see if you qualify for that class action. We're pursuing similar actions in Israel and also our criminal complaint in The Hague. Dr. Boyle, wrap it up now, and we'll bring you back next week if you're free, because this is super important, as to what the ramifications of all of this is for the American people.
Right, Larry. Well, I guess the one point I would make that I haven't already is that it was publicly reported November 16 that there was pneumonia cases over there in Wuhan. Now, for whatever reason, the 17 U.S. intelligence agencies didn't tell this to President Trump until January 23. And even then, they went pretty light on it, according to the New York Times. Well, Larry, our intelligence agencies should have been able to figure out sometime after a week, no more than November 16, that this was coming out of the Wuhan BSL-4, and it was existentially dangerous gain of function. All they had to do was look it up in Fauci's computer. He was paying for it, okay? And if they had acted and informed President Trump, I'm not trying to let President Trump off the hook here at all, but if they had gone in and said, you know, this is what's going on here, they could have informed China to shut down Wuhan no later than the third week in November, and all this could have been avoided.
Well, you know, I'm not blaming the president either. He was going through an impeachment right then, and it caused him to take the eye off the ball. I also believe that maybe the intelligence agencies didn't inform him to set him up, because they've been trying to get him out of office, so he would take the blame. But whatever happened, you're absolutely right, Doctor. With the mass surveillance capabilities of our intelligence agencies, and I've enjoined them twice for illegal mass surveillance against the American people after Edward Snowden revealed what was going on, they had to know. And for whatever reason, it wasn't conveyed to the American people. In fact, I have another lawsuit on that in Washington, D.C., to obtain documentation showing that they knew it and that they knew it from the start. But I want the American people to understand, and I want to thank you for your courage in coming forward, that the enemy here is not just the communist Chinese. The enemy is our own government that plays games, and it's plays games continuously in my youth and in my adult life, from the Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam to Watergate to the Iraq War, you know, the false pretext of weapons of mass destruction. You can't believe anything, and don't drink the Kool-Aid that you see on cable news networks. You know, you have to think through this yourself. And in this case, it's clear, at a minimum, the communist Chinese released this. They're responsible for the damage. We need to make them pay. They've got assets in this country. We can make them pay, and we need to set an example. And I thank you, Doctor, for everything that you've done and will do in this, because we need more people like you who are courageous and will come forward with the truth. So I want to tell all the American people, stay safe. This is a dangerous situation. It's still unfolding. It's developing, and we're going to have the doctor back whenever he's free. And God bless you. God bless your family. God bless America, and God save America. Thank you for listening to us.